On the 22nd of December, 1943, a reporter from the Associated Press looked at a small Adriatic port town in eastern Italy and called it a miniature Stalingrad, and within days that phrase had reached Canadian newspapers, Canadian radio, and Canadian memory, where it has stayed ever since. This is the story of the 8 days of street fighting that followed, of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division that fought them, and of the 3 things that almost every account of this battle gets wrong. Start with the number everyone repeats. 1,375. That figure turns up in article after article and documentary after documentary, always carrying the same claim, that this is what Ortona cost Canada. The figure is real, it comes from a real source, and it does not mean what it is almost always used to mean. 1,375 is the number of Canadian graves in the Moreau River Canadian War Cemetery, 5 kilometers south of Ortona, as recorded by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The cemetery holds 1,615 burials in total, more than 50 of them unidentified, and the Canadian portion of those graves comes to 1,375. Those graves cover the entire stretch of fighting from the Moreau River to Ortona and the weeks on either side of it, and they are burials, not a casualty count for the street fight inside the town. For the fighting inside Ortona itself, the official Canadian estimate records 275 casualties, of whom 104 were killed. 275, not 1,375. Both numbers are true, and they measure completely different things, and the fact that an error of that size has survived 80 years of retelling is the first clue that the popular story of Ortona and the historical one parted company a long time ago. The Italian campaign was designed as a sideshow, and that was not a verdict passed after the war, it was the plan. In May of 1943, the combined chiefs of staff set the terms. Italy was to be knocked out of the war, German divisions were to be tied down and held away from the coast of northern France where the invasion of Europe was already being drafted, and the Soviets were to be relieved of pressure. Every one of those objectives sat underneath something else, and the proof of that runs through the order of battle. 7 Allied divisions were earmarked for withdrawal from the Mediterranean after the 1st of November, 1943, to be shipped to Britain for Operation Overlord. The historian G.C. Case, writing in the peer-reviewed journal Canadian Military History, puts the point precisely, that the theater was deemed to be of secondary importance even before military operations commenced. Consider what that meant for the men who fought there. The Italian campaign was a holding action wearing the shape of an offensive, where ground was to be taken but the reserves that might have exploited that ground were already being loaded onto ships bound for England. Every yard gained in Italy was gained by a force that was, by design, being drained. There is a modern equivalent, and it explains the Italian campaign better than most military metaphors manage. Anyone who has worked inside a large organization knows the failure state, where a division is kept open, kept staffed, and kept publicly committed to its targets, while the capital that would let it hit those targets gets quietly reallocated to the flagship project. Nobody shuts the division down, because shutting it down would concede the ground. The division simply starves. The people inside it are still measured against the original targets, they still take the losses of a real operation, and they cannot win, because winning was never funded. That was the 8th Army on the Adriatic coast in December of 1943, and Ortona is what happens when a starved theater gets asked to produce a headline. The German defensive system across the Italian peninsula in late 1943 carried the collective name of the Winter Line, and it was not one line but 3, the Gustav Line, and west of the Apennines the Bernhard Line and the Hitler-Sanger Line. At the eastern end of that system, on the Adriatic coast, sat Ortona. A word about terminology, because the sources disagree and this channel does not smooth over disagreement. Popular accounts variously place Ortona on the Gustav Line or on the Bernhard Line. The standard usage, and the one followed here, comes from the official history, which puts Ortona inside the Winter Line system on the Adriatic. Where you meet a confident single-line label attached to this battle, treat that label as a compression rather than a fact. The British Eighth Army held the Adriatic sector, commanded until late December of 1943 by General Bernard Montgomery and afterwards by General Oliver Leese, with General Harold Alexander above them both at Army Group. Facing them, as Commander-in-Chief Southwest and Commander of Army Group C, stood Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Between the 23rd and the 30th of November, 1943, the Eighth Army crossed the Sangro River and broke into the Gustav Line, and the advance rolled north along the coast toward the next water obstacle, the Moro River, roughly 6 kilometers south of Ortona. Montgomery's stated intention was a colossal crack, which meant punching through, reaching Pescara, and then swinging west along the lateral highway toward Rome. That was the ambition in November. By the middle of December, the rain had killed it. Mud on the Adriatic in December of 1943 did what mud has always done to mechanized armies, which was to end any possibility of a breakthrough. Pescara vanished as a realistic objective, Rome vanished with it, and the aim contracted from a strategic breakthrough down to a single town, because Ortona held a deepwater port, one of very few usable harbors on the east coast, and because the supply lines of the Eighth Army at that moment still ran all the way back to Bari and Taranto. That is the honest strategic case for taking Ortona. A port, to shorten a supply chain. Not a road to Rome. A port. The formation that would take the town was the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Christopher Vaux. Vaux had turned 39. He was a permanent force officer, a professional soldier inside an army overwhelmingly made up of citizen soldiers, and he had come up through the Royal Canadian Engineers. Promotion to Major General reached Christopher Vaux on the 1st of November, 1943, which means that when the 1st Canadian Infantry Division crossed the Moro River, its commander had held divisional command for roughly 5 weeks. Ortona was the first battle Vaux ever fought as a divisional commander. Under Vaux, the 1st Infantry Brigade answered to Brigadier Howard Graham. One correction for the record, since some popular accounts assign the 1st Brigade to Daniel Spry in this period, and Graham is the standard attribution, and Graham is the name used here. The 2nd Infantry Brigade, the formation that would fight in the streets, answered to Brigadier Bert Hofmeister. The battalions were these. The Loyal Edmonton Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Jim Jefferson. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, under Lieutenant Colonel Sid Thompson. Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. The Royal Canadian Regiment. The 48th Highlanders. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, whose intelligence officer was a young lieutenant named Farley Mowat, and whose acting commanding officer was Major Burt Kennedy. The Royal 22nd Regiment. And the Saskatoon Light Infantry, providing machine gun support. Armor came from the 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade under Brigadier Robert Wyman, which meant the Three Rivers Regiment, the 12th Armoured, going into the town, the Ontario Regiment, the 11th Armoured, fighting at Casa Berardi, and the Calgary Regiment. Engineering support came from the Royal Canadian Engineers, and the guns belonged to the Royal Canadian Artillery and the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. Waiting for them in the town would be the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, German paratroopers, commanded by Generalleutnant Richard Heydrich, whose 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment answered to Oberst Ludwig Heilmann, promoted to Oberst on the 1st of December, 1943, 3 weeks before the battle. Richard Heydrich was not in Ortona for most of the fighting. The commander of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division went on leave to Germany during the battle, in the belief that reinforcements would hold the line without him. The division that would give the Canadians the hardest 8 days of the Italian campaign fought a good portion of that battle with its commanding general away on leave. Holding the Moro and the ground behind it, before the paratroopers arrived, was the 90th Panzergrenadier Division under Generalleutnant Karl-Hans Lungershausen, a formation with Afrika Korps lineage that had originally been raised as the 90th Light Infantry Division. Above them, the German chain of command ran through Field Marshal Kesselring at Army Group C. At 10th Army, the standing commander was Colonel General Heinrich von Weidinghoff, but through the Ortona period the acting 10th Army commander was Colonel General Joachim Lemelson. Keep that distinction in mind, because the most damning German assessment of this entire battle passed between Kesselring and Lemelson, and not between Kesselring and Vietinghoff. Commanding the 76th Panzer Corps on this front was General Traugater. On the Canadian flank stood the 5th Corps under Lieutenant General Charles Alfray, the 8th Indian Division attacking toward Villa Grande and Talo, and the British 78th Division, which the Canadians relieved before the Moro. Further inland, at Orsogna, the 2nd New Zealand Division under General Bernard Freyberg held the line. On the 1st and 2nd of December, 1943, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division relieved the British 78th Division, and Christopher Vokes took over the sector. 3 days later, on the 4th, Lieutenant General Charles Alfray ordered Vokes across the Moro River, and ordered it urgently. The crossings went in on the night of the 5th into the 6th of December, at 3 points. Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel Cameron Ware, crossed at Villa Rogati, and got across. The Seaforth Highlanders crossed at San Leonardo, and were driven back. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment crossed at San Donato on the coast, as a diversion. The successful crossing turned out to be the wrong one. Villa Rogati, taken by the Patricius, was handed over to the 8th Indian Division as the boundaries shifted, which meant the Canadians had to fight for San Leonardo all over again, and the bridgehead there was not consolidated until the 9th of December. There is a bridge in this story that deserves to be better known. At Villa Rogati, the Canadian engineers of the 3rd Field Company, Royal Canadian Engineers, examined the site and rejected it. The gradients, the approaches, the ground, none of it worked, and a bridge could not be built there. That was the professional judgment. The 69th Field Company of the Bengal Sappers and Miners, part of the 8th Indian Division, then built a bridge at Villa Rogati anyway, and they built it in reverse. It is remembered as the Impossible Bridge. Christopher Vokes, himself a Royal Canadian Engineers officer by training, a man whose entire professional formation had been bridging and demolition, found out afterwards. His own words on the subject were these: "I was in an evil temper when I learned about this, but by then it was far too late." Hold on to that image, of a divisional commander from the engineering branch, whose engineers had told him a crossing was impossible, learning that another army sappers had just built it. That is the first sign of something that runs through the whole of the Ortona battle, which is the gap between what the map and the doctrine and the staff insist is possible, and what is actually sitting there on the ground. Beyond the Moro bridgehead the ground rose toward Ortona, and cut across it, running roughly parallel to the road from Ortona to Orsogna, lay a ravine. The Canadians called it the Gully. On the maps issued to the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, the gully appeared as little more than a thin line. A creek bed. The Fosso Saraceni, the Fosso Sant'Ilario. A watercourse marking, the kind of feature a staff officer's eye slides over without stopping. What was actually out there depends on which source you read, and the disagreement between them is itself instructive. One set of accounts gives an average depth of around 200 feet, roughly 61 meters, running about 3 miles, some 5 kilometers, all the way to the Adriatic. The historian of the Royal New Brunswick Regiment, Captain David C. Hughes, writing for the Fredericton Region Museum, describes a ravine more than 70 feet deep and more than 900 feet wide. The estimates shift depending on the source and on which point along the length of the thing you happen to be standing at. Every account agrees on the only part that mattered. The gully was a natural anti-tank ditch, several kilometers long, sitting directly across the Canadian axis of advance, and it did not appear on the map in any form that told anybody what it was. There is a failure mode in modern geospatial systems that carries a name, the resolution gap. A digital terrain model is only ever as good as the sampling density behind it, which means a feature can be entirely real, entirely present, and entirely lethal, and still remain invisible to the system because it falls below the resolution at which the map was built. Autonomous vehicles have driven straight into unmapped features that any local resident could have described from memory. The data was not wrong. The data simply lacked the detail to contain the thing that mattered. Canadian maps in December of 1943 were not wrong about the gully either. They rendered it at the resolution available, a thin blue line, correct in its position and catastrophic in what it left out, and the 1st Canadian Infantry Division walked into that ravine at the resolution of the map rather than the resolution of the ground. The 90th Panzer Grenadier Division held it. Between the 10th and the 14th of December, 1943, Canadian battalions went at the gully frontally, one after another, and were cut to pieces, at a cost of roughly 1,000 casualties. Lieutenant General Charles Alfry reportedly warned Christopher Vokes that he was tiring out his division and producing nothing, for want of coordination, and after that warning Vokes handed the fire planning over to his artillery commander, Brigadier Matthews. Understand the shape of what happened at the gully, because that shape underpins every criticism ever leveled at Christopher Vokes. Repeated frontal attacks, battalion after battalion, into a feature nobody had properly identified, against a defense nobody had properly located. Canadian field and medium artillery fired more than 3,000 tons of shells during the fighting for the gully, a figure that comes from the historian Terry Kopp. 3,000 tons of shells, and the line did not move. On the 14th of December, 1943, the deadlock at the gully broke, and it broke because of a single company of French-Canadian infantry and a captain named Paul Triquet. Captain Paul Triquet commanded C Company of the Royal 22nd Regiment. With tanks from the Ontario Regiment, the 11th Armoured, Triquet was sent to outflank the gully by taking the manor house at Casa Berardi. His Victoria Cross citation, published in the London Gazette, records what the strength of that company had become by the time it reached the objective. By this time the strength of the company was reduced to 2 sergeants and 15 men. 2 sergeants, and 15 men, and nothing else. Captain Paul Triquet organized those men into a defensive perimeter around the surviving tanks, and the citation preserves the order he gave them. Ils ne passeront pas. They shall not pass. The Royal Canadian Horse Artillery then fired 5,398 rounds in support of that perimeter, against the German counterattacks that came in against it. The arithmetic of C Company at Casa Berardi runs like this. The company entered the engagement at a strength of 81 men, and according to the Mural of Honor at the military museums, a mere 9 of those men were still fit and able by the end of it. Across the whole action the company recorded 23 dead and 107 wounded, a figure preserved by the Encyclopédie du patrimoine culturel de l'Amérique française, and a figure that reflects reinforcement of the company during the fighting rather than a simple percentage of the original 81. Notice what the definitions do to the numbers even here. At company scale, in a single action, you still cannot subtract one figure from another without knowing exactly what each of them counts. Paul Triquet received the Victoria Cross, the first awarded to a Canadian in the Italian campaign and the first in the Mediterranean theater, and he remained the only Quebecer to receive the Victoria Cross in the Second World War. Later he rose to Brigadier General. Triquet also spent the rest of his life fighting what he called the noise of the mind. Alcoholism took hold of him, and Paul Triquet died in 1980. Remember that phrase, the noise of the mind, because the psychiatric cost of Ortona is not a footnote to this battle. It is one of the 2 or 3 most important things about it, and we will come back to it with numbers. Between the 15th and the 17th of December, 1943, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division consolidated and pushed further attacks against the gully. On the 15th, the paratroopers of Oberst Ludwig Heilmann, specifically the 1st Battalion of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Regiment under Major Rudolf Boehmler, took Villa Grande. Around the 13th of December the 90th Panzer Grenadier Division had been relieved in the line by the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, which meant that the formation Christopher Vokes had been grinding against was replaced by something considerably harder. On the 18th and 19th of December, Operation Morning Glory went in, carried out by the 48th Highlanders and the Royal Canadian Regiment, and it took the Cider Crossroads. The Cider Crossroads sat astride Highway 16, the coastal road, another feature that failed to appear on the Canadian maps in the form the Canadians needed. Taking that crossroads opened the way into Ortona. On the 20th of December, 1943, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade under Brigadier Bert Hoffmeister assaulted the southern outskirts of the town, while at the same moment the 1st and 3rd Brigades moved west and north, to cut Highway 16 behind it. Mark that second movement carefully and hold it. When historians later argue about whether Christopher Vaux understood what he was doing at Ortona, the flanking move to cut Highway 16 becomes the single strongest piece of evidence in his defense, and we will return to it. On the 21st of December, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada entered the town, with the Sherman tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment. The street fight had started. Ortona was not defended. Ortona was engineered. The German plan, executed by the 2nd Battalions of the 3rd and 4th Parachute Regiments of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, never depended on holding the outskirts. The plan depended on giving them up. Here is how it worked. The paratroopers demolished buildings, deliberately and systematically, to collapse rubble across the side streets, 10 to 15 feet of it, sown with mines, sown with booby traps. Every route through the town that a Canadian company might reasonably use was made impassable, or made lethal. Every route except one. Highway 16, running through the town as the Corso Vittorio Emanuele, was left invitingly clear, a broad, open, passable main street leading directly into the heart of Ortona and into the piazze, the squares, and above all into the Piazza Municipale. Inside those squares, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had built killing zones. Tanks buried in the rubble up to their turrets. Concealed MG-42 nests. 50mm anti-tank guns, laid on the open ground and waiting. The German defensive scheme at Ortona amounted to a funnel, where you block every path but the one you have pre-registered, and then you wait for an army in a hurry to walk down it. Anyone who has worked in network security will recognize the architecture at once, because it is the mirror image of a modern honeypot and functionally identical in its intent. You do not attempt to harden every route, because you cannot. Instead you close, monitor, and mine every route except one, and you make that surviving route look like the path of least resistance, and the intruder, behaving perfectly rationally, takes the cheapest path. The cheapest path is the one you build for them, instrumented, and covered. The paratroopers in Ortona were never trying to stop the Canadians from entering the town. They were trying to control where the Canadians entered it, and for the first days of the fight, that is precisely what the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division achieved. The Canadian answer to that funnel is the most famous thing about this battle. If the streets are mined, the squares are covered, and the rubble is booby-trapped, then you stop using the streets. You go through the walls. The technique runs like this. Place a charge, APIAT round, a teller mine, an engineer demolition charge, against the shared wall between one house and the next, and blow a hole through it. Push a section through that hole into the adjoining building, on the upper floor. Clear the building downward, top to bottom, dropping grenades through the floors ahead of you rather than fighting up a staircase into a defended landing. Then move to the next wall, and the next. Blow, enter, clear, repeat, an entire block cleared without a single man stepping into the street. The technique is called mauseling, and Canadian popular memory, including institutional sources, including Veterans Affairs Canada, including the Canadian Military Engineers Association, will tell you that Canadians invented it at Ortona. That is not true. The Modern War Institute at West Point, in its Urban Warfare Project case study on Ortona by John Spencer and Major Jason Jeru, states the point without hedging, that the method was not invented by the Canadians. It had already been formalized in British doctrine, where it went by the name of the vertical technique, and it had already been taught in British battle schools before Ortona. Soviet forces had used the same method in the ruins of Stalingrad in 1942, a full year before the loyal Edmonton Regiment blew its first hole through a wall on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. The technique reaches back further than that. Fighting through the interiors of buildings rather than the streets between them recurs across 19th and 20th century urban combat. Mausling is not a Canadian invention, and it is not a 1943 invention. What the Canadians did was something else, and something better. They took an existing technique and applied it at a scale, with an intensity, and with an integration of infantry, armor, and engineers that had never been seen before in the Western Allied experience. They adapted it under fire, in an urban battle nobody had trained for. And this is the part that matters most: they wrote the lessons down and passed them on, and the Canadian experience at Ortona was disseminated to other Allied armies. That is the true claim. Canadians did not invent Mausling. Canadians took a technique that existed on paper and in Soviet practice, turned it into a working system of urban assault under conditions of extreme violence, and then taught it. There is a pattern here that has almost nothing to do with war and everything to do with how invention actually gets credited. The history of technology is full of it. The technique exists, it is documented, it sits in a manual or a research paper or an obscure repository, doing nothing. Somebody then implements it at scale, under real conditions, with real stakes, and solves the 10,000 practical problems that the original description never mentioned. And because the implementation is what the world sees, the implementer gets remembered as the inventor. The relational database, the graphical user interface, the smartphone, the pattern repeats every time. Invention takes the credit that implementation earned. Ortona is that same story in miniature, written in explosives. British doctrine wrote the method down. Soviet infantry fought it first, in a city the Canadians would soon be compared to. Canadians made it work, at scale, in 8 days, and then collected the credit for inventing it. The honest version of what Canada achieved at Ortona survives perfectly well without the invention myth. By the 22nd of December, 1943, the town had been divided into sectors, and the fighting had descended into something Canadian doctrine had no language for. The war artist Charles Comfort described a medieval battle in its close-quarter violence, groping through suffocating dust and smoke, stumbling over upturned furniture and debris, felling, clubbing, blasting, shooting it out. Read that list again. Felling. Clubbing. In December of 1943, in a war of radios and tanks and massed artillery, Canadian infantry were clearing rooms in a way that the word clubbing describes accurately. Tactical arrangements inside Ortona inverted the normal relationship between the arms. Sherman tanks of the Three Rivers Regiment were pushed forward into intimate close support, into streets where a single infantryman with a charge could destroy them, which meant the infantry sometimes protected the tanks rather than the other way around. The role reversal was complete. The PIAT, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, served double duty as an anti-tank weapon and as a wall-breaching tool. 17-pounder anti-tank guns of the 90th Anti-Tank Battery, Royal Canadian Artillery, were manhandled forward through the rubble, dragged by hand into positions from which they could dominate the Corso Garibaldi and the seafront, and the 6-pounders went with them. The mortars did work that is hard to comprehend at this range. In one instance, a single German pocket inside the town absorbed 1,100 3-inch mortar bombs in a single area shoot. 1,100 mortar bombs, into one pocket, inside a town. Infantry were issued 12 to 15 grenades per man, per day. Not per battle, per day. The regimental analysis written by the Seaforth Highlanders reaches a conclusion that belongs at the center of how this battle gets understood, which is that Ortona became a platoon commander's battle. Command devolved, because it had to. In the dust and the rubble and the collapsed streets, a battalion commander could not see his companies, a company commander could not see his platoons, and the radio nets could not repair what the geometry had broken. Decisions about where to breach, when to push, and when to pull back were made by lieutenants and sergeants and corporals, inside whatever room they happened to be standing in. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division did not win Ortona through generalship, and whatever you eventually conclude about Christopher Vaux, that much is not in dispute. Ortona was won, to the degree that it was won at all, by junior leaders operating without effective higher direction, because higher direction had become physically impossible. That is a hard thing for an army to admit, and a harder thing for a national memory to celebrate, and it is what the evidence says. Now the name. On the 22nd of December, 1943, a reporter from the Associated Press described Ortona as a miniature Stalingrad. The date and the origin are recorded in the official history, Colonel G. W. L. Nicholson's volume, The Canadians in Italy, 1943 to 1945, at page 328, and cited in the peer-reviewed work of the historian G. C. Case. A press wire, filed on day 2 of the street fighting. Canadian newspapers seized it, the CBC seized it, and within days the town of Ortona carried a name that would follow it for 80 years, in variants. Little Stalingrad. The Italian Stalingrad. The Stalingrad of the Adriatic. Consider the comparison on its own terms. Stalingrad was fought between army groups, over months, and it ended in the annihilation and surrender of an entire German field army. Ortona was fought by 1 Canadian infantry division against 2 German parachute battalions, over 8 days, and it ended with the German defenders walking out of the town under their own orders, intact. The scale does not compare, the outcome does not compare, and the strategic weight does not compare. Here is the part that turns the label from an exaggeration into something that genuinely matters. The name did not merely describe the battle. The name helped cause it. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief Southwest, wrote this to Colonel General Joachim Lemelson, the acting commander of the 10th Army, during the fighting. It is clear that we do not want to defend Ortona decisively, but the English have made it appear as important as Rome. You can do nothing when things develop in this manner. It is only too bad that the world press makes so much of it. Read that slowly. The German theater commander is saying, in the middle of the battle, that Germany did not want to fight for Ortona, that the town had been inflated into a prize by press coverage, and that once inflated it could no longer be given up, because giving it up would now mean something. Lemelson's reply, on the same point, was that it cost so much in blood, it cannot be justified. The acting commander of the German 10th Army said that the blood being spent at Ortona could not be justified, and he said it while it was being spent. On the Canadian side, one of the men who actually fought in the town said the same thing in different words. Major Jim Stone of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment, the officer whose bold plan on the Corso on the 22nd of December drove the Canadian attack, said this after the war, recorded by the historian Daniel Dancox in the D-Day Dodgers. Ortona was a frightfully fought battle. It should never have been fought. There is a mechanism at work here that is not a military mechanism at all, it is an attention mechanism. A label gets applied to an event by a media system, and the label is not descriptive, it is comparative, and the comparison is enormous. The label spreads because the comparison is compelling rather than because it is accurate. And then, in the step that matters most, the actors inside the event begin responding to the label rather than to the underlying reality. The battle becomes important because it has been called important. The cost of withdrawal rises, not because the ground has become more valuable, but because the coverage has made withdrawal legible as defeat. Anyone who has watched a modern news cycle attach a name to an ordinary event, and then watched institutions reorganize their behavior around that name, will recognize the shape of it exactly. The label creates the stakes, and the stakes justify the label. Kesselring identified all of that in December of 1943, in a field message, and named the mechanism precisely. The world press makes so much of it. Ortona was called Little Stalingrad on day 2, and then, in part because it had been called that, it was fought like it. On the 24th of December, 1943, an order came down from the highest level of the German state, that Ortona was to be held at all costs. That order arrived at a front where the theater commander had already said, privately, that Ortona was not worth defending decisively. Both things were true at the same moment. Hold that contradiction, because we will need it later. The bombardment on Christmas Eve was heavy, and the Seaforth Highlanders were fighting around the church and in the square that some accounts call Dead Horse Square. The chaplain of the Seaforth Highlanders was Padre Roy Durnford, and his diary entry on Christmas Eve, written in a town under bombardment, reads as follows. Deathly chatter of machine guns. Rumbling of falling buildings, roar of guns. On the 25th of December, 1943, Christmas Day, the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada served Christmas dinner inside the bombed church of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli, which was serving as their headquarters. The quartermaster, Captain D.B. Cameron, organized it. Companies were rotated back out of the fighting in shifts, C Company arriving first at around 11 in the morning, with each shift getting roughly 2 hours. The tables carried white tablecloths. There was soup, roast pork with applesauce, cauliflower, mashed potatoes and gravy, Christmas pudding and mince pie, 1 bottle of beer per man, oranges, nuts, chocolate, and cigarettes. Lieutenant Wilf Gildersleeve played the church organ, Padre Roy Durnford held short services between the shifts, and the officers of the Seaforth Highlanders served the meal to the men by hand. Each shift then went back into the street fighting, and the next shift came in. Padre Roy Durnford also wrote this about the dinner. People are going to get killed going to that dinner and others are going to die coming back. That sentence belongs at the center of the Ortona Christmas story, and it is the sentence that almost never gets quoted. The chaplain who blessed the meal understood exactly what the meal would cost, that men would be killed walking to it and men would be killed walking away from it. He wrote that down, and the dinner went ahead anyway, because the alternative, Christmas in the rubble with no break and no roof and no hot food, was judged to be worse. 213 Canadians were killed during Christmas week at Ortona, a figure recorded by Veterans Affairs Canada. The Seaforth Christmas dinner at Ortona is among the most reproduced images in Canadian military history, with its long tables, its men in battle dress, its ruined church. Research by Ben Moog on the Canadian Film and Photo Unit raises a serious problem with the most famous of those photographs. The argument runs like this. In the iconic image, some of the men are wearing the shoulder patches of other units rather than those of the Seaforth Highlanders, and the setting appears to be an open patio, which at Ortona on the 25th of December, 1943, would have sat well within German mortar range. That concern is not theoretical, because the roof of Santa Maria di Costantinopoli had itself been hit by a German mortar bomb on the 22nd of December, at 10:30 in the morning, 3 days before the dinner. The conclusion that Moog's research points toward is that the famous photograph may not have been taken at Santa Maria di Costantinopoli at all, and that it may instead show a dinner held in the divisional headquarters area, at Marina di San Vito. Be precise about what is and is not being disputed here. The Seaforth Christmas dinner at Ortona happened. It sits in the war diary. The shifts, the church, the organ, the officers serving the men, the padre's foreknowledge of the cost, all of that is documented, and none of it is in question. What is in question is the photographic record, and some of the retellings that were built on top of it. The event is solid. The most famous image of the event may be showing you something else entirely. That distinction matters more than it might first appear, because the photograph does an enormous amount of work inside Canadian memory. It is the image that makes Ortona bearable, with its tablecloths, its organ music, its officers serving the ranks. If the most reproduced picture of the most humane moment in Canada's hardest battle was taken somewhere safer, then Canadian memory of Ortona has been anchored, for 80 years, to an image that softens it. The photographer of the Canadian Film and Photo Unit who took the picture, Terry Rowe, was later killed at Anzio. The Seaforth Highlanders still hold an annual Ortona dinner in Vancouver, and the tradition of officers serving the ranks spread out from that church to other regiments. On the 27th of December, 1943, a platoon of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment was destroyed by a building demolition when the Germans brought the structure down on top of them, and the men were buried alive. One of them was dug out 3 days later. The Canadians answered with the same weapon, and a building holding roughly 20 German paratroopers was blown up. That is what the 8th day of Ortona looked like, two armies, in a town that neither high command had wanted to fight for, collapsing buildings onto each other's men. On the night of the 27th of December, 1943, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division walked out. They were not driven out. They withdrew, deliberately, under their own orders, in good order, and on the morning of the 28th of December, Canadian troops moved forward through Ortona and found the town empty. The battle was over. The German paratroopers left that battle when they chose to leave it, and they left it intact, and the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division did not consider itself defeated. Compare that, one final time, against Stalingrad, where a German army was surrounded, ground down, and forced into surrender in its entirety. At Ortona, the defenders decided the ground had cost the enemy enough, and then they left. The fighting did not stop with the town. On the 27th of December the 8th Indian Division took Villa Grande, on the 29th the 48th Highlanders took San Nicola and San Tommaso, and the advance north reached Torre-Mucchia on the 4th of January, 1944. On the 31st of December, 1943, a blizzard came in off the Adriatic and stopped everything, and General Oliver Leese recommended halting the 8th Army offensive. Winter closed the front. Pescara was never reached. Rome was reached eventually, from an entirely different direction. The port of Ortona had been taken. Now we go back to the number from the opening, and we do it properly, because the casualty figures for Ortona are the most systematically misused statistics in Canadian military history. Every number that follows carries its definition with it, and the definition is the fact. Figure 1. 1,375. The definition is the number of Canadian graves in the Moreau River Canadian War Cemetery, per the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. The geography covers the whole of the Moreau to Ortona fighting and the surrounding weeks. The category is burials. This is not a battle casualty count, and it is not a count for the town. Figure 2. 275 casualties, 104 of them killed. The definition is the official Canadian estimate for the fighting inside Ortona itself. The geography is the town, and the category is casualties, with the killed included. Figure 3. 2,339 battle casualties, 502 killed. The definition covers the 1st Canadian Infantry Division for the whole month of December, 1943. The geography is the entire divisional front, from the Moreau River through Ortona and beyond, and the category is battle casualties, meaning killed, wounded, and missing. Figure 4. 3,956, all ranks. The definition comes from the divisional total for December of 1943 in Christopher Vokes's own Fighting State Report, preserved in Colonel C.P. Stacey's Canadian Military Headquarters Report No. 165. That figure is the 2,339 battle casualties, plus 1,617 men recorded as sick or neuropsychiatric. Sit with Figure 4 for a moment. In Christopher Vokes's own return for December of 1943, the number of men lost to sickness and psychiatric breakdown reached 1,617, against 2,339 lost to enemy fire. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division was losing roughly 2 men to illness and mental collapse for every 3 it lost to the Germans. Figure 5. The regimental record of the Seaforth Highlanders for December of 1943 gives 1,837 wounded or sick, and 502 killed, including 35 officers killed, 127 wounded, and 14 missing. Figure 6. Almost 4,800 members of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division evacuated over the course of the battle, as casualties, or because of battle exhaustion, or because of illness. That figure comes from the Urban Warfare Project case study at the Modern War Institute, and the definition matters enormously, because it explicitly includes exhaustion and illness. It is not a battle casualty figure. It is a total evacuation figure, and it is the properly sourced version of the various 4,000 plus numbers that circulate freely. At unit level, inside the town, the Loyal Edmonton Regiment recorded 172 casualties including 63 killed, while the regiment's own museum records 63 dead and 109 wounded. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada recorded 103 casualties, 41 of them killed. Now the numbers to distrust. There is a widely circulated claim that the 1st Canadian Infantry Division suffered around 4,600 casualties in the Ortona fighting alone, against roughly 1,400 Germans. That claim conflates operation-wide evacuation totals, which include the sick and the psychiatric, with the town battle itself. It is not reliable, and it should not be repeated. None of this is really a history problem. It is a data problem, and it is the same data problem that every serious institution now wrestles with. Any organization that reports a headline metric knows the trap. What counts as an active user, someone who opened the app, or someone who used it? What counts as a death from a disease, died of, or died with? What counts as a job created, gross, or net? The number is never the fact. The definition attached to the number is the fact, and the moment a number gets separated from its definition and released into public circulation, it stops meaning what it measured and starts meaning whatever the audience assumes it measured. 1,375 was a definition-bound figure, meaning Canadian graves in a specific cemetery, covering a specific period. Stripped of its definition, that figure became a headline, the cost of Ortona, and the headline runs to more than 5 times the actual death toll inside the town. That is how a battle in which 104 Canadians were killed inside the town became, in national memory, a battle in which 1,375 died. Nobody lied. A definition was dropped. German figures are worse. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division reported daily losses for Ortona between the 21st and 31st of December, 1943, coming to 73 killed, 158 wounded, and 220 missing. That figure derives from divisional returns, and it should be treated with caution, because it survives largely in secondary circulation rather than in accessible archival form. What the German records do support is this. By the end of December, 1943, the battalions of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had reportedly been reduced to roughly the strength of a single company each. The frequently repeated claim of 867 German dead, or nearly 900, rests on poor sourcing. It appears in popular history and in journalism, and it deserves to be flagged rather than repeated as fact. German record-keeping for the town fight is fragmentary, and this channel is not going to launder an estimate into a statistic by saying it confidently. What can be said is that the 90th Panzergrenadier Division was effectively destroyed in the Morro and Gully fighting. Christopher Vokes put it this way in his own report, and treat that report as the partisan source it is. We smashed the 90th Panzergrenadier Division, and we gave the 1st German Parachute Division a mauling which it will long remember. Now return to Paul Triquet's phrase, the noise of the mind. Ortona is the defining Canadian case study in battle exhaustion, and the numbers are extraordinary. The psychiatrist of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division was Major Arthur Manning Doyle. Between the 7th of December and the 28th of December, 1943, across the 22 days of the Morro and Ortona fighting, Dr. Arthur Manning Doyle saw nearly 600 soldiers for psychiatric evaluation, a figure recorded by Parks Canada. Out of those 600 men, Doyle cleared only 20 to 25% for return to duty. The historians Terry Kopp and Bill McAndrew, in Battle Exhaustion, Soldiers and Psychiatrists in the Canadian Army, 1939 to 1945, the book that brought this entire field of Canadian history into existence, record roughly 350 cases seen between the 7th and the 21st of December, with 226 psychiatric casualties in a single peak week. On one day, Dr. Doyle examined 57 patients, and still could not keep abreast of the deluge. 57 men in one day, through one doctor, and the queue behind him got longer. More than 500 men of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division were diagnosed with battle exhaustion in December of 1943, and Terry Copp's finding is that battle exhaustion accounted for more than 1 in 4 non-fatal casualties. Across the 17 months of the Italian campaign, the Canadian Army recorded 5,020 neuropsychiatric casualties, which comes to roughly 17% of battle casualties. About 1 in 5 of every non-fatal casualty evacuated was evacuated for exhaustion. Now the part that is genuinely contested, and this channel is going to state the dispute precisely rather than resolve it for dramatic effect. In Christopher Vokes's divisional return for December of 1943, neuropsychiatric casualties were not itemized separately. They were folded into the category marked sick. 1,617 men, sick, with the psychiatric cases sitting inside that figure, undifferentiated and invisible. Dr. Arthur Manning Doyle himself supplied the interpretation that made those men disappear. Doyle concluded that 84% of all cases he saw were suffering from some form of psychiatric disorder prior to military service. 84%, pre-existing. Under that framework, a man who broke in the rubble of Ortona had not been broken by Ortona. He had arrived broken, and the army had merely discovered it. The battle was not the cause. The battle was the diagnostic. By April of 1944, 1,234 exhaustion cases had been evacuated from the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, and fewer than one-third of them ever returned. The reframing that Doyle performed carries a modern name, and it is a name most people will have met in an entirely different context. The pre-existing condition exclusion. It is the mechanism by which a system that would otherwise be liable for an outcome relocates the cause of that outcome to a point before the system's involvement began. The claim is not denied, the claim is reclassified. The event did not cause the damage was already there, and the event merely revealed it. Liability evaporates, not through argument, but through categorization. Whether Arthur Manning Doyle believed that framework, or merely needed it to be true, is not something the evidence settles. What the evidence does show is what happened to the framework afterwards. Doyle's assumptions were rejected. In May of 1944, before the Hitler Line battle, the medical staff at General Burns's headquarters overturned them, and Arthur Manning Doyle was, in the language of the record, banished to the Corps maintenance area. Be careful about how far this evidence reaches. What the record establishes is underdifferentiation in the divisional returns, and a doctrinal reframing of causation by the divisional psychiatrist. What the record does not establish is a proven, deliberate conspiracy by commanders to suppress the numbers, and that distinction is real, and this channel will not collapse it for effect. The effect on the historical record turned out the same regardless of intent. For a generation, the psychiatric cost of Ortona sat inside a column marked sick. There is a category of casualty at Ortona that Canadian accounts have historically underweight, and it is the largest one. The people who lived in the town. The most commonly cited figure runs to around 1,314 Italian civilians killed. Other sources say more than 1,000, or more than 1,300. Those figures come largely out of Italian local historiography, from Marco Patricelli's 2002 book on Ortona, and from Fabio Tonselli's documentary, Ortona 1943, on Natale di Sang. Ortona 1943, A Christmas of Blood. State the evidentiary problem honestly. No rigorous contemporaneous count of the Ortona civilian dead exists. Many civilians died buried in rubble, killed by the demolitions that both armies were using as weapons, in a town where collapsing a building had become a recognized tactic. The figure of roughly 1,300 is an estimate. It is not a verified register of names. Now notice what that estimate means when you set it beside the Canadian numbers. 104 Canadians killed inside the town. An estimated 1,300 Italian civilians killed. The civilian dead of Ortona may outnumber the Canadian dead of the town fight by more than 10 to 1. Consider the timeline of the scholarship, because it explains a great deal. Mark Zulka's Ortona, Canada's epic World War II battle, the book that defines this battle for the Canadian reading public, was published in 1999. Marco Patricelli's Italian account of the battle was published in 2002. The definitive Canadian popular history of Ortona was written 3 years before the Italian account of the civilian catastrophe appeared. That is not an accusation against Mark Zulka. It is a structural fact about how this battle entered Canadian memory, because the Canadian story was fixed before the Italian story had been told. Italian historiography, meaning Patricelli, Tonselli, and the Centro Studi Italia Canada, frames Ortona differently from the way Canada frames it. Not as a Canadian feat of arms, but as a shared catastrophe, in which Canadian soldiers, German troops, and Italian civilians were all victims of a single tragic fate. The British correspondent Christopher Buckley, quoted by the historian Terry Kopp, left an image from inside the town that belongs in the Canadian record and rarely appears there. Buckley described a half-darkened room, with anti-tank guns firing down the street outside, and the children of Ortona clinging to the soldiers. Soon, he wrote, each of us had a squirming, terrified child in our arms. That is the battle as well. That is the same 8 days. Which brings us to the argument that has run through Canadian military history for 35 years, over whether this battle should have been fought at all, and whether Christopher Vokes was fit to fight it. Two schools exist. Both are serious, and both are held by serious historians. This channel is going to put both of them in front of you, name the historians, name the journals, and then decline to tell you who won. The case against Vokes begins with the historian Brereton Greenhouse, who published an article in 1989 in the Canadian Defence Quarterly, in Volume 18, Issue 5. Note the journal carefully, because it is the Canadian Defence Quarterly and not Canadian military history, and that citation gets botched constantly. The title of the article is itself a challenge. Would it not have been better to bypass Ortona completely? Greenhouse answered yes. His argument held that the town should have been bypassed entirely, and that the port, the entire logistical justification for the battle, was more or less useless, because it was too small to matter to the supply problem of the Eighth Army. Responsibility for what Greenhouse characterized as battering ram tactics he laid on Christopher Vokes personally. Greenhouse wrote that the town was attacked because, in a very humdrum way, taking Ortona itself was the next logical step, that Ortona, after all, was the immediate, direct objective. And on the handling of the gully, Greenhouse was withering, because that decision, he wrote, was not the decision of a moderately clever general. The historian David Bercuson extended the argument in Maple Leaf Against the Axis, published in 1995, and Bercuson's verdict was that the battle should not have been fought at all, and that when it was fought, it was done so for the wrong reason. The American historian Rick Atkinson, in The Day of Battle, minimized the whole battle, treating it as a minor episode. Then there is the assessment of Christopher Vokes attributed to General Bernard Montgomery, which has followed Vokes through history like a shadow. Montgomery called him a good plain cook. A good plain cook. Competent execution, no flair, no imagination, put the meat in the oven and turn it on. The case for Vokes begins with the historian Terry Kopp, who, writing with Richard Nielsen in No Price Too High in 1996, answered Greenhouse and Bercuson directly, defending the proposition that Ortona had to be taken. The fullest rebuttal came from the historian G.C. Case, in the peer-reviewed journal Canadian Military History, in 2007, in an article titled Trial by Fire, and Case's argument deserves to be stated in full, because it is more honest than a simple defense. Case concedes the point. From the vantage point of hindsight, Case writes, Ortona probably should have been bypassed entirely. What follows is the whole of it. At the time, no one on the Allied side, let alone Christopher Vokes or his staff, had any inkling that the Germans would stand and fight. Case supplies the evidence for that claim. Nowhere in the Allied experience in the Mediterranean had there ever been an instance in which the Germans had fought a protracted urban battle. Not in North Africa, not in Sicily, not on the road up from Salerno. The German pattern, everywhere the Allies had encountered it in that theater, was to delay and withdraw, to blow the bridges, hold the ridge, and fall back to the next line. Christopher Vokes did not send the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade into Ortona expecting an 8-day street fight. Nobody in the 8th Army expected an 8-day street fight, because in that theater, the Germans had never fought one. The remainder of Case's argument runs like this. The gully was invisible on the maps. The weather was catastrophic. The army group plan that Vokes was executing was unrealistic. Vokes had held divisional command for 5 weeks. And, as we flagged earlier, the simultaneous movement of the 1st and 3rd Brigades to cut Highway 16, north and west of the town, may have been the actual main effort. Which would mean that the street fight was never the plan. The street fight was what the plan produced, when the Germans did the one thing they had never done before. Both cases now sit on the table. Greenhouse and Bercusen say the battle was avoidable, and that Vokes is the reason it was not avoided. Kopp and Case say the battle only looked avoidable afterwards, and that Vokes was solving a problem no Allied commander in the Mediterranean had ever faced. This channel is not going to resolve that for you, because the historians have not resolved it either. The argument about Christopher Vokes at Ortona is a local skirmish inside a much larger war among Canadian historians, and it is worth naming, because it shapes everything you will ever read about the Canadian Army in the Second World War. The historian John A. English published The Canadian Army and the Normandy Campaign, a study of failure in high command, in 1991, and the subtitle is The Argument. English delivered a harsh verdict on the Canadian Officer Corps, calling it bureaucratic, technically weak, and professionally inadequate. Behind English stands an older tradition. The official historian, Colonel C.P. Stacey, and behind Stacey the British theorist B.H. Liddell Hart, had both suggested something considerably more uncomfortable, that the failing lay not only with the commanders but with the soldiers, and that Allied troops underperformed. It is the inversion of the famous phrase from the First World War. Not lions led by donkeys, but donkeys led by lions. Against that stands Terry Kopp, and the newer generation of biographies, offering a sympathetic revisionist reappraisal, arguing that Canadian commanders and Canadian soldiers were solving genuinely hard problems under genuinely bad conditions, and that the harsh verdicts were written by people who never had to. A regimental essay by the Seaforth Highlanders on Ortona carries a pointed title. The Canadians at Ortona, putting the lie to Hart and Stacey's donkeys led by lions. The regiment that fought in the church, arguing with the official historian, 80 years on. There is one more figure in this argument, because you cannot discuss Christopher Vokes without discussing the men who commanded the brigade that fought in the streets, Brigadier Bert Hofmeister. The historian Douglas Delaney, in The Soldier's General, Bert Hofmeister at War, published in 2005, a book that won the C.P. Stacey Award, argues that Bert Hofmeister was the most successful Canadian battlefield commander of the Second World War. Here is what makes Hofmeister the perfect counterweight to Vokes. Hofmeister was not a professional soldier. He was a militia officer, a citizen soldier, where Christopher Vokes was permanent force. Delaney's argument holds that Hofmeister led from the front and built teams, and Delaney draws the contrast explicitly with General Guy Simons, who, in Delaney's phrase, used fear. It would be very easy to end the story there. Vokes the plain cook, Hofmeister the natural. The professional who ground his division down, and the amateur who understood men. Douglas Delaney does not let it end there, and neither will this script. Delaney is critical of Bert Hofmeister's initial handling of operations beyond the Morro. More importantly, at Ortona, As the casualties mounted, Bert Hofmeister was given a choice about whether to continue the battle. Hofmeister insisted that the battle be fought to the end. The brigadier, who is remembered as the humane commander, the one who led from the front, the one who built teams rather than ruling through fear, was offered the chance to stop the street fight in Ortona, and he refused it. Whatever Ortona was, it was not a battle that a bad general forced on a good one. Both of them chose it. There is one more contradiction to resolve, and it is the one that finally settles what little Stalingrad was worth as a description. The question is whether the Germans intended to hold Ortona to the last man, or whether the whole thing was always a delaying action. The evidence points three ways at once, and all three of those directions are true simultaneously. At the top, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring did not want to defend Ortona decisively, and he said so, in writing, to Colonel General Joachim Lemelson, during the battle. The strategic intent of the German theater commander was delay. From the state, on the 24th of December, 1943, came an order from the highest political level that Ortona was to be held at all costs. A last-man order, issued over the head of a theater commander who had already concluded that the town was not worth it. On the ground, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division fought a deliberate, engineered, pre-planned defensive battle, with the funnel, the demolitions, and the killing zones, and then executed an orderly withdrawal on the night of the 27th of December, of its own volition, leaving the battlefield intact. Layer those three facts together and the Stalingrad analogy collapses completely. Stalingrad was a battle of annihilation, where an army was encircled, fought to destruction, and surrendered, and it remains the definitive image of a fight to the last. Ortona was a delaying action that got politically ordered into becoming something else, fought by paratroopers who executed a textbook defensive plan and then left once the ground had cost the Canadians enough. The men of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division did not consider themselves defeated, and they were not wrong. Ortona was called Little Stalingrad by a wire reporter on the second day of the fighting, and the label described the intensity of the street fighting accurately. It described nothing else about the battle accurately at all. Not the scale, not the stakes, not the strategy, and not the outcome. The German theater commander named the mechanism at the time. The world press makes so much of it. The men who fought at Ortona came home to a country that had, by then, mostly stopped paying attention to Italy. They were called the D-Day Dodgers, a slur suggesting that the Italian campaign was the soft option, the theater for men who had avoided the real war in Normandy. The phrase is popularly attributed to a British parliamentarian, and that attribution is probably wrong. The men of the 8th Army took the insult and made a marching song out of it, and they sang it about themselves. We are the D-Day Dodgers. The historian Lee Windsor, of the University of New Brunswick, argues that the Italian campaign has been disproportionately forgotten, and that the forgetting is regionally uneven. About 3/4 of the Atlantic Canadian units that served in the Second World War fought in Italy, while national commemoration has settled almost entirely on Normandy. 3/4 of the Atlantic Canadian units, in the theater that Canada forgot. Terry Kopp's answer to the sideshow charge is worth stating plainly. The Italian campaign tied down German divisions, and it lasted twice as long as the entire advance from Normandy to the Baltic. Twice as long as the campaign that everybody remembers. 5 kilometers south of Ortona, at San Donato, lies the Moro River Canadian War Cemetery. The Canadian Corps chose the site in January of 1944, in the weeks immediately after the battle, while the ground was still frozen. It holds 1,615 burials, more than 50 of them unidentified, and 1,375 of them Canadian. It is the largest Canadian war cemetery in Italy. In the Piazza Plebiscito, in the center of Ortona, stands a bronze monument called the Price of Peace, known also as the Tribute to the Canadian Liberators. It was unveiled in 1999, commissioned by Canadian veterans after a reunion in Ortona in 1998, and designed by the Canadian artist Rob Surrett, and it shows a wounded Canadian soldier being comforted by a comrade. The base of that monument incorporates bricks taken from the buildings destroyed in the fighting. The rubble of the town is holding up the memorial to the men who made it. In November of 2000, the Government of Canada erected a plaque in the same square. Ortona is a national historic event, recognized as symbolizing the efforts of the Canadian Army in the Italian campaign during the Second World War. Ortona has a museum dedicated to the battle, and it holds annual commemorations. In 2014, the town of Ortona entered a twinning relationship with Volgograd, the city that was once Stalingrad, and that relationship has been largely dormant since 2022. The Seaforth Highlanders of Canada still hold their Ortona dinner every year in Vancouver, and the officers still serve the ranks. The 80th anniversary of the battle was marked in December of 2023. Here is where the evidence leaves us. The number is wrong. 1,375 Canadians lie buried at Moreau River, from a month of fighting across an entire divisional front, while 104 Canadians were killed inside the town of Ortona. The gap between those two figures is not a lie. It is a definition that fell off a statistic somewhere between the War Graves Register and the National Memory, and nobody has ever put it back. The technique was not invented here. Mausling sat in British doctrine before Ortona, and Soviet infantry used it in the ruins of Stalingrad a year before any Canadian blew a hole through a wall on the Corso Vittorio Emanuele. What the 1st Canadian Infantry Division did was make it work, in 8 days, at a scale nobody had attempted, and then teach it to the armies that followed. That is the achievement, and it does not need the myth. The name was a wire reporter's shorthand, filed on the 22nd of December, 1943, and it outlived every man it described. The German theater commander watched the world press turn a town that nobody wanted into a town that nobody could abandon, and he wrote it down while it was happening. It is only too bad that the world press makes so much of it. An officer of the loyal Edmonton Regiment who fought in those streets said afterwards that the battle should never have been fought. The acting commander of the German 10th Army said, while it was being fought, that the blood could not be justified. Historians have been arguing about who was right since 1989, and they have not stopped. 1,100 mortar bombs into one pocket of one town. 12 to 15 grenades per man, per day. 600 men through one psychiatrist's hands in 22 days, and 84% of them recorded as having been broken before they ever arrived. An estimated 1,300 Italian civilians dead in a town of narrow streets, in a battle where collapsing a building onto the people inside it counted as a recognized tactic, used by both sides. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division walked out of Ortona on the night of the 27th of December, 1943, under its own orders, and did not consider itself defeated. The Canadians walked in on the morning of the 28th and found the town empty. Ortona has a deep-water port, and it was taken. The 8th Army never reached Pescara. Rome fell from another direction entirely, 6 months later, to somebody else. The bricks from the buildings that were blown down in those 8 days sit in the base of the monument in the Piazza Plebiscito, holding it up.